And people believed that like there were certain like fields and roads, and that's where the Klan would go, and they would do their things, and they would murder people. And then there were other fields and roads, and that's where the devil worshippers would go, and they would murder people.
Not the same roads.
Both of them. Not the same roads. Exactly. There were different people, different roads, but like
three roads diverge in the yellow field.
Exactly. And as long as you pick the right path, you're fine. But if you went the wrong way, you're either going to run into the Klan or the devil worshippers. It's one of the two.
Well, I found out that one of the two isn't real.
yeah, exactly. And I think by the time I was growing up, I don't actually know if there were that many, Klansmen running around North Alabama. Maybe there were, but that was sort of, amongst like the kids and stuff. That's what we were afraid of, right?
This is Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. That's Brett Talley, an author of several best-selling novels and anthologies, including He Who Walks in the Shadows, That Which Should Not Be, and The Fiddle is the Devil's Instrument. He has been twice nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement, the top award for horror writing presented annually by the Horror Writers Association. The works of writers that are nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, which is named after the Irish Victorian-era Gothic fiction writer who is the author of Dracula, are nominated by juries and members of the Horror Writers Association. That Which Should Not Be was Brett's first novel, and it was published in 2011. In addition to being nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for first novel, it was a semi-finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards and the winner of the Journal Stone Horror Writing Contest. That Which Should Not Be takes readers on a journey to Miskatonic University, a fictional school with a whispered reputation for being connected to the occult and the supernatural, where a professor and a student search a nearby village for a book that's believed to control all non-human forces that rule the earth. The pair bring the book back to Miskatonic, opening up a gate to the netherworld. Brett was also nominated for a 2014 anthology, Limbus Inc., Book 2. He edited that book, where 5 masters of horror, fantasy, and science fiction writing take readers on a world of time travel, human sacrifice, intergalactic beings, and more. Brett is also the author of several true ghost stories and a nonfiction book called Haunted Tuscaloosa, which explores the paranormal in the Alabama town, from the now shuttered local insane asylum and antebellum mansions said to be haunted by ghosts, to cemeteries where Confederate soldiers are still said to march, and ghost stories from the University of Alabama grounds. Brett is an attorney, and his interests include horror, science fiction, the paranormal, and other whodunnit and whatdunnit mysteries. He's the host of the Prosecutor's podcast, where he and his co-host Alice LaCour tackle well-known and less-known true crime cases. But they also tackle some mysteries, some flat-out hard-to-explain events. Over the years, they've had episodes about the Dyatlov Pass incident, where 9 Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains, and the 1993 Kymar-Dabain incident, where 6 hikers disappeared in the mountains near the enormous Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. They have covered whether the moon is hollow, the Salem witch trials, the mystery of whether the Soviets lost cosmonauts in space, and the story of Adolfo Constantino, who surely believed he could use human sacrifice and magic to move cocaine into the United States from Mexico. Brett's co-host, Alice, calls him a true Renaissance man, and I have to agree. The Prosecutor's podcast was the 2023 winner of the People's Choice Creator of the Year Award at CrimeCon. This October, Brett and Alice have told weeks of real-life horror stories, from the 1987 story of Ruthie Mae McCoy, the chilling story of a murder of a woman that happened because people broke through her medicine cabinet, and that led to the movie Candyman and what Brett and Alice called The Man Who Killed Halloween, the 1974 case of Ryan Clark O'Brien, who killed his 8-year-old son Timothy by lacing pixie sticks with potassium cyanide. Today we're going to discuss the paranormal, horror, science fiction, and all that's mysterious and spooky, both about fiction and in reality. It's October 30th, and this is the first of 2 episodes with Brett. The next episode will drop tomorrow morning on Halloween. Brett, just wanted to thank you for joining me again, and just flag for everybody those 2 great episodes we did with Alice a couple months ago, where you guys had a chance to talk about sort of your role as prosecutors and podcasters. And, you know, one of the coolest things about that conversation for even people who are not interested in true crime or, you know, prosecutors or the law, so much of that conversation was really about community. And I thought that message about community was so important. The point that you made about how we don't have a lot of that anymore. So many of those communities have broken down. So I just wanted to appreciate or share that appreciation with you and let you know that we got a lot of really positive feedback about that idea of community.
Well, I'm so glad to be back on the show. You know how much I appreciate you, and that those 2 episodes. You know, it's funny. You go into things like this, you never really know how they're going to go. You just kind of have these free form discussions, and I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed about it. Is it was just a discussion. It wasn't super structured or anything. Right. And it's funny the things that will come out when you don't have that kind of structure, and that wasn't a point I think we meant to make, but it just, as we were talking, it became sort of obvious to both of us. Yeah, how important that was. And it's something that I've mentioned in subsequent discussions with people, because I think it was sort of eye-opening to talk it through and really things that I sort of knew intuitively to bring them sort of to my own consciousness, because I think I love community, the community that we've built so much. And, you know, we're going to be talking about horror today, and there's a horror community. And that was one of the things I always loved about horror, is that it's the same kind of thing, bringing people together from just completely divergent backgrounds, might have nothing else in common, but they have in common this one thing, this love of, in the case of horror, the macabre.
Right. I was just gonna, I was just thinking about the idea of, like, there's so many things I hate about social media, so many things I hate about, like, let's just say social media. But the ability of it to bring together communities of people with similar interests. Oh, I know where this came from. I was talking to somebody about true crime, and I was like, you realize we're all weirdos in our own neighborhoods, but, like, together, you know, as a collective community of people who have a similar interest, we're able to bond over so much more and share, I guess, have such rewarding experiences with each other. And that's one of the powerful things about that, if that makes sense.
No, I think it makes total sense. And I think social media is the ultimate double-edged sword, and there's so much bad about it. And we focus on the bad a lot. I mean, we focus on how it divides people, how it allows people to be bullies and stalkers and do and say horrible things to people they've never met, things they would never say in person. Right. You know, people, I remember we were getting ready for CrimeCon, and people were like, are you worried about CrimeCon? You know, are you worried that people are going to come yell at you and stuff? And I really wasn't, because I knew the people, the same people who do that kind of stuff on social media in person don't tend to do it. And sure enough, like, CrimeCon was a love fest, even though I'm sure there were many people there who disagreed with us on all sorts of things. And you see that in social media, but you're 100% right. It also is, we're all weird. Every single one of us.
Yep.
You know, I don't care how normal you think you are, there's something about you that other people would think are weird. And frankly, I think that's what makes people interesting. I think if there was nothing weird about you, you'd probably be pretty boring. You'd probably be a pretty boring person.
It's part of what makes us beautiful. Like, our quirks are really what make us interesting and beautiful. I'm glad we're talking about this topic, but I just wanted to make a shout out to you and Alice for winning the People's Choice Creator Award at CrimeCon. That's an award that's voted on by listeners, right?
Right. Yeah, that's one reason it was particularly special to us, is because it was voted on by listeners, and there are so many great podcasts out there, and most people, if they listen to one true crime podcast, they listen to multiple ones. So to have that many people decide to give their, they already give us their time, which will always appreciate the fact that people spend an hour of their lives, their precious lives, listening to us, but then that they would turn around and say, and of all the podcasts I listen to, I'm going to vote for you. It was something. And I can't say thank you enough to all the people out there who did that.
Yeah. Did they tell you that it was because of your October episodes? Is that why?
That was exactly what it was. But it's over the top.
Right. So I was going to just sort of like jump into your October episodes for a sec, if you don't mind. I had just listened to the episode, The Man Who Killed Halloween, which was about the guy who, I forget what year it was. It was like in the 1970s. He poisoned his 8-year-old son with pixie sticks, right? It had potassium cyanide or something along those lines.
Right. 1974.
Yeah, 1974. And I remember like growing up in the 80s, you made that point that it was like the perfect time in the episode, you said, where like communication was great enough that messages could make their way around, but communication wasn't great enough. We didn't have the internet, so we couldn't check things out. And that part really resonated with me, because I remember all of the sort of like rumors and stories that we used to hear around those times, some that had to do with horror, some that had to do with other things, but we had like Dungeons and Dragons is going to like suck us all into Satanism. Look out for the razor blades in your Halloween candy. And, some of it wasn't all that serious. Some of it, like the Satanic Panic probably had negative implications on people's life. And so I was going to ask, like, I remember during that time, I became interested in horror for a variety of different reasons. Lots of good writing and television. Stephen King was writing some of his best books, or at least in my opinion, actually, because all of his books are great. But some of at least the most meaningful ones for me. What was going on for you during that time of sort of like growing up, and how did you become interested in things like horror and science fiction?
Well, I'm very much a child of the 80s. I was born in 1981, so that was my formative years. So that whole period. I mean, the 80s are really interesting for a lot of different reasons. You already talked about sort of the ability, and it's amazing. I wish someone would look into this. I'm always interested in this kind of stuff. Like, how exactly did we know all this stuff? How did these sort of urban legends spread around? Like, do you remember Yellow 5?
No. Which one was that?
So the people who are listening will remember this, but so in Mountain Dew, there's a coloring agent called like yellow number 5.
Yes.
You remember it. You remember what it was said to do, right?
Yes.
And I'm not exactly sure where you grew up. You grew up in Maryland? Were you in Maryland at the time?
Maryland, Georgia, and Texas. But yeah.
Maryland, Georgia, and Texas. I'm in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. Right? And we're here, you and I are hearing the same rumors that like if you drink this, it's going to have like a negative impact on, certain parts of your body. The rest
of your life, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Yes. How did that happen?
I have no idea.
Like, how did we all know that? Like, I have no idea how that kind of thing spreads across the country. And I guarantee you, every single person listening to this who grew up, who was born before like 1990, and maybe afterwards, for all I know, knew about that. And there wasn't any internet. There were no chat boards. There was nothing, but everybody knew about it. And that was what's sort of weird about the 80s is you had just enough communication, just enough interconnectivity that things like that could spread. The Satanic Panic could spread. Rumors could spread about all sorts of things. And so I think you kind of lived in a world of a little bit more mystery back then.
Yeah.
Because there was no way to disprove that. If somebody told you a fact, you could go home to your Encyclopedia Britannica, if you had one, and pull it out and see if there was an entry for
You're
it.
shocked, right?
So there was just nothing you could do, I mean, maybe you could go to some sort of expert, but there was nothing really you could do. And there was that sort of the world was more mysterious when we were growing up than I think it is for kids now, because now you're just covered up with information. And obviously there's a different side to it now. I mean, we have fake news and all that stuff. And with artificial intelligence, we're going to have separating fact from fiction is going to be really difficult going into the future. But we were just in a very unique place. And I think you combine sort of that mystery with a lot of the other stuff that was going on. The 80s was sort of a golden age for horror. A lot of your traditional slasher movies were big then. They'd started in the 70s with Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but then you're seeing all the Friday the 13th and all the Nightmare on Elm Streets, and people were into horror at the time. In a way, they weren't so much in the 90s. The 90s was kind of a wasteland for horror until Scream came out. Scream sort of revitalized that whole thing. But for me, to answer your question, I've talked a lot without actually answering your question. For me, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was what...
I totally know. Thriller, right?
Thriller.
Right.
Thriller.
Right. That may have been the first really horror thing I ever saw.
Absolutely.
He was my first concert, actually.
Is that right? That's awesome.
It was amazing.
I never saw Michael Jackson in concert. I consider that a huge loss.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I was growing up, that Thriller video, I had it on some medium. The 80s was also a time when there was all these mediums that popped up for like 5 minutes and went away. And it was some medium. It was like a massive disc. It was like a big square.
Betamax?
And it wasn't Betamax. It was like flat. It's hard to even describe it. It was probably like a foot by like a foot, maybe, square. And the only thing it had on it was the Thriller video. And we had a thing that would play it. And so I owned the Thriller video on this disc thing. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a massive floppy disk, basically. And you would slide it into this machine, and this is an example.
And it would play on the machine?
It would play it on your television.
Wow.
So I watched, and I had Thriller on record, on vinyl too. So I would listen to Thriller all the time, and I would watch that video, and I was just totally enthralled by it. And that is absolutely 100% what started my love of horror and the mysterious and all that stuff, was that video from Michael Jackson. Whenever it came out, I'm not even sure when it came out. Probably before I really had a conception of Michael Jackson. But then once I was old enough to understand, that video completely captured me. And then it was just, it was similar to like a lot of people, the whole R.L. Stine. I feel like R.L. Stine doesn't get enough credit. We talk about Stephen King a lot because Stephen King, obviously the master, but R.L. Stine, most people know him for Goosebumps. I was a little too old for Goosebumps, but I read his Fear Street books when I was in like middle school and early high school. Yeah. Those were like his like preteen teen horror, which was a little bit more adult, a little bit scarier, that kind of stuff. Netflix just made some shows about this. Sorry if I ramble. I just love.
Oh no, feel free. No,
but it was. And then in high school, I read Stephen King for the first time, and then it was over. Yeah.
So R.L. Stine was sort of like the gateway drug.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thriller was, I think Thriller, because I would have seen that. It had to be like 83, 84, something around that range. And, when I think of it, I can still remember the scenes. I can remember what Michael Jackson was wearing. I can remember the characters. It was so visceral to that piece. But it was that was your first introduction, gateway drug, Stein, and then eventually Stephen King.
Right, yeah.
That's interesting. What was it that when you watched that Jackson video, what was it that just captured your imagination?
I don't know. I don't know if it was because part of it was I probably shouldn't have been watching it. I was probably too young for it. I don't know why my parents let me have it, because my parents were very much in the I love them to death, but they were very much in the whole satanic panic thing. I mean, they totally believed that.
They're afraid, yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons they're devil worshippers out in the woods. I mean, we believed all this, right? Like I can remember there were two groups of people that we were terrified of: the Klan and the devil worshippers. And people believed that there were certain fields and roads, and that's where the Klan would go, and they would do their things, and they would murder people. And then there were other fields and roads, and that's where the devil worshippers would go, and they would murder people.
Not the same roads.
Both of them. Not the same roads. Exactly. They were different people, different roads, but like
three roads diverge in the yellow field.
Exactly. And as long as you pick the right path, you're fine. But if you went the wrong way, you were either going to run into the Klan or the devil worshippers. It's one of the two.
Well, I found out that one of the two isn't real.
yeah, exactly. And I think by the time I was growing up, I don't actually know if there were that many, Klansmen running around North Alabama. Maybe there were, but that was sort of, amongst like the kids and stuff. That's what we were afraid of, right?
It's interesting you say that, because I think that for my mom, who grew up a lot earlier, that there was probably an association between sort of like the Klan where she was growing up and kind of like ghosts that come bump at the night and stuff like that. Like she always said, like the not Casper, because Casper is not threatening, but like some of those ghost outfits really sort of caused her to like take a step back at times, which is interesting because out of my parents, my dad probably grew up closer to the Klan in South Carolina than my mother, but it's funny how kind of similar that feel is.
Well, that's an interesting thought. And the whole devil worshiper thing, I mean, I don't know that there have ever actually been, at least in modern times, and maybe ever, people out in the middle of the woods dancing around a fire, like, to their dark god or whatever. But there certainly were people doing that in the South and like beginning of the 20th century, right?
Right.
And they did the white sheets. I mean, all that stuff. That is a really interesting dynamic there, sort of a connection there. And obviously, I mean, they only come out at night. They are deadly, they are hunting you. I mean, all that stuff. I mean,
cross on fire.
Right? You can see how there would be that connection. I mean, you really can see how there's that connection. And it's interesting that you say that about your mom, and it's interesting just a white kid growing up in Alabama. Nevertheless, in my mind, there was very little distinction between these two groups of people. They were both very dangerous people who were out at night, and if you happened to stumble upon them, they were going to murder you.
Bad things.
That's what we believed. And I just, in my whole life, it's so funny. Like I never even questioned that. I can remember being in high school and people saying that, like, calling like a road, like that's a Klan road, right? Like, and now I'm like, why did we say that? Like that probably wasn't even true.
Right? What was it about that poor road?
Yeah, what was it about that road that made people think that? Like in the middle of Jasper, Alabama, where I was from. Like I can still remember exactly where that road is. It's just weird. It's just strange the way. But this goes back to what we're kind of talking about, like sort of the way that legends grow up and you make sense of the world around you because. Growing up in the 80s, and I'm sure you experienced this as well. I mean, the civil rights movement wasn't that long before that.
No,
it was only, I mean, frankly, it was still going on, right? I mean, in a real way, it was very much still going on. And the power of those sorts of organizations had only recently been broken, if they had been broken at all.
And morphed a little bit into the background, which kind of actually made them a little bit scarier, I think, on some levels.
And I've never seen anybody, and I realize that we've completely gone off the rails now, but I've never seen anybody.
There are no rails here.
That sociological development in the South of sort of transforming this very real thing into sort of a legend, right?
But you know what? It reminds me of like my uncle used to talk about the boogeyman, right? Mm-hmm. Or like he would say that there was something he would put on the top of the dresser when we were little kids. And he said that if we got up, it would get you. And there were often kind of like these subtle, almost Klan references to it, right? That like the Klan, to some extent, for some Black families became like the boogeyman. And yeah. And it was the scary thing that would happen if you got up at night. And I think, I don't know whether, I've never talked to my parents about whether that existed in their generation where the Klan was very open. Mm-hmm. But I know for like, a kid of the 80s, some of my family members would make references. I mean, because you'll do anything to get a kid to actually go to sleep. So,
right.
Yeah. Right. And I wonder whether there is this like connection in people's minds that goes, this fear of the unknown, fear of the hidden, fear of the thing that you can't see, or even this power that people get through the combination of that. But I definitely remember my uncle on my father's side making sort of like boogeyman references that kind of linked to it, this big bad kind of scary, almost like, now that I think about it, I need to have a conversation with my uncle and let him know that was a little too far. In retrospect, that may not have been the move. But, we did the same thing. Like when I was growing up in Marietta, Georgia, there were like these houses down the street that there were stories about, like, do not go to that house on Halloween because, I don't know, they're going to have razor blades with their candy, or walk on the opposite side of the street. Now, in retrospect, years later, I just realized like there was other, they were struggling or whatever. They they had these very normal things, human things going on, but like there was always myths with it, right? So the kids in the neighborhood would say, "Don't go by this house." You would say, "Why?" Well, somebody died there around X time, and da 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 da. And there would be this whole elaborate myth of a story around the spooky house in the neighborhood. Now, I know the people in Long Island who live near Rex Ehrman's house, they may have been right there. Right. And that's in the Long Island serial killer case, they might be right. But like we had many things like that. Like there was a path that you weren't supposed to walk on past, I don't know whether it was midnight or whatever, or, and then some backstory about a kid who had disappeared. And that's why they named the neighborhood across the street Ashley Estates. But we had all these kinds of stories, and actually, in reality, there the Ashley was just the name of the architect's daughter.
a little less dramatic.
Less dramatic, yes. But like, there's something that, despite the scary part about being a kid and having a fantasy world, and like, yeah.
And I think part of that, number one, kids can take anything and turn it into a fantasy. I'm learning that having two little kids. It's amazing their ability to make something amazing out of the most mundane. And I think horror has always been, and part of it, horror, we talk about horror and we separate it out, but it really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like folklore, right? I mean, traditionally, the scary stories have been folklore, and a lot of times they're either to sort of conceptualize something that's hard to explain, or to keep people from doing something they shouldn't do. So you shouldn't go into that old abandoned house because it's haunted and there's, whatever. Okay, that's one reason not to go into it. The other reason not to go into it might be the house is falling down and there's, lead paint chipping off the walls. And who knows, there might be someone, living in there who's dangerous or whatever. So you shouldn't go into the house for all those reasons.
But selling me on the lead paint problem as a 6-year-old probably isn't going to work.
Exactly. If you tell kids there are wolves in the woods, even if there hadn't been wolves there for 200 years, they're much more likely not to go in the woods, right?
Right. Yep.
And I really think that's part of it. I think we build up these legends and we tell these stories to just conceptualize things that are difficult to explain or difficult to understand or difficult to deal with, whether everything from the dangerousness of the house to death itself. Like we're constantly trying to deal with that. And one way we do it is we tell stories.
Yeah. One of the things I remember in high school, my journalism teacher handed me a book on fairy tales. I really have to wonder about why she gave me this, but it was like my graduation gift from her. And it was a book on fairy tales, but it told like the real stories, the original stories of the fairy tales. So it was like all these very sweet fairy tales, but you find out that the original version was like creepy. And so like all these things that Disney had turned into these very positive, happy stories, and one of the threads of them, one of the really interesting threads was that many of these fairy tales really existed to get kids to do things.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But Parenting 101, horror for your kids.
Yeah. I mean, You learn that very quickly. You can't explain anything to them. You can't ask them sweetly. Sometimes you just have to scare them.
Right. And if they're the right age, it's got to stop because the why has to be combated, right? So for me, like my real sort of journey actually started really probably more with science fiction. I got into, I don't remember, I don't know if you remember this from the 80s, but there was this television series called V, and it involved.
I remember it.
Oh, yeah. So it involved, aliens coming to Earth, wanting to make peace, but they were really secretly reptilian, and they were trying to harvest the humans. And I remember like the first time I saw the scene where one of the aliens in humanoid form like ate a bird, and I was like, huh. And then the facilities for harvesting them. And it was really interesting for me. So I have a lot of takeaways from that. It was scary. It was enthralling. It was transporting, because I even remember imagining myself as different characters, like characters on the Resistance, characters on the alien side. But it was really instructive in a different way. And you could sort of like, there are parallels with Star Wars. But like, I learned a lot about like values and politics and fascism and individual rights. And I wonder whether like on some level, science fiction, horror, and some of these things, just like we were talking about children, give us an opportunity to communicate stories to like a broad audience that would be harder to stomach in a more direct way, if that makes sense. That, I always think about like the whole arc of something like Star Wars, to many extents, like you could take that whole story and plant it on the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and have a very sort of like parallel story. But I wonder whether like we digest things. My favorite example is Pet Sematary, because to me, that Stephen King book is really about grief and the cost of not managing your grief. And I think if you came to me and you told me, as probably my therapist has said many times, Jayson, if you don't manage your grief, bad things will happen. Well, if you hand me Pet Sematary, I'm like, okay.
Right. And I think that's 100% right. And I think that's the great thing, and not just about horror and sci-fi, but a lot of art is that way, in that, the best stuff isn't beating you over the head with an idea. You're sort of coming to it yourself.
Right.
And sci-fi and horror, I think in many ways are uniquely, it's like, because it's not real, right? I mean, if you read a book on World War II, or if you read even a fictional novel set during the Holocaust or during World War II, half your brain is fact checking it as you're reading it. And, could this really happen? It's funny. It's harder to suspend your disbelief the more realistic the book is. Right?
You can't let go. I didn't even think of that. You can't really let go if there's like in historical fiction. Yeah.
Right. But if you already are suspending your disbelief and putting yourself in a galaxy far, far away, or in a world in which there are, zombies and spirits that can raise the dead and wendigos and like all this other stuff. If you've already done that, you've already kind of opened yourself up in a way you don't even realize. Mm-hmm. You've opened yourself up to taking in everything the author is giving you. And a lot of times what you are going to end up taking in are much more complex ideas than if you just looked at the surface. I think that's one reason people often say that books are better than movies, because when you make a movie out of a book, it's much harder, I think, usually, to have as much of the subtle, rich subtext. You can do that so much better in a novel than you can in a movie. Even if you can have it in a movie, it's harder to do it, and usually it's more in your face.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. And
like you can read Dracula and get all sorts of stuff about sort of Victorian norms and sexuality and like all this other stuff. And it's much, much more sort of subtle. And then if you watch like Dracula 1989 or whatever, you get all that, but it's really in your face, right?
It's like hitting you on the head. Ding, ding,
exactly.
ding, 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 ding.
Exactly.
Well, I remember for me, like, it's funny too, because I've read a lot of Stephen King, and over the years, I will go back and reread some of those books I read when I was younger and take away different messages. But even as a kid, like, I think the first King book, I really remember reading it. May not have been the first one for me, but it was Firestarter, I think was the first one I at least remember. And, it's a book about paranormal. It's a book about a girl whose parents were, I think it was some kind of government experiment on them that led to her ability to start these fires.
Right.
And, I walked away with like a lot of lessons over the years, like one of which is like, I wonder what our government is really doing. And two, and then when I was older, I realized our government can't really hold down a conspiracy. So I worry less. But, but I also like learned a message about self-control in that story that I don't think my parents could have taught me directly. And then there were books like The Stand, for me, was like a fascinating one, even though it is about secret government stuff. It was almost like a story about like the people who lead us and other things like this. And I always tell people that, like, until I read Carrie, I feel like Carrie is really the book that taught me the danger or the downside of bullying people. And
Right.
yeah, and not so much because of what happened to everyone, but just that scene where she's in the bathroom and she's in the middle of her menstrual cycle. And I just felt so bad for her at a point I didn't even know as I'm reading it what a menstrual cycle was. And I just feel like when I think of my values, those kinds of books and stories planted the seeds in ways, and I'm going to apologize to my minister for saying this, that my pastor was never able to get through my soul.
Well, I mean, it's like Jesus. Let's talk about Jesus. Jesus doesn't write horror novels, but let's talk about Jesus. Jesus, when he's preaching, doesn't just say, "This is what I want you to get from this." Right? He doesn't just say,
"It's true.
Here's the lesson. Here's what you should learn from this. Now go do it." Right? He told stories and parables. And
Yep.
and you in the parable, much like the sci-fi novel or the horror novel, is a story that draws you in and makes you think about the characters and makes you think about what they're doing and makes you sort of reach your own conclusion about what the lesson is. And that's just a much more effective way, I think, to do that kind of thing. I think it always has been. And I think you've really put your finger on it with horror and sci-fi, and I think that's why the books that you've been naming are the books that everybody remembers, right? Like, people can write just books that are meant to scare you, and those might be successful, and you might be scared by them, and you might even think about them every now and then. But the books that really affect you not just because they frightened you, but like you said, helped you develop the way you think about the world and your values and how you should treat people, and like who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and how to overcome adversity, right? I mean, that's a huge thing in horror, is how to overcome the worst possible adversity you could ever face. When the odds seem like they are completely against you and you've lost everything you cared about. Like, how do you keep on against that, right?
It's so funny too, because you just made me think of two things. The part with Jesus and the part with parables and the part with all these different things. Like, it allows us to have ownership over it. But one of the things you were talking about, the adversity, I thought of, have you read the book? It's another King book, but God, why can't I think of the name? It's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon.
I have not. I haven't read that.
Okay. One. So it's a story about this girl who ends up lost in the woods. And I mean, 95% of the book is this girl lost in the woods, which is scary, right, at that age. And she's got her Walkman in, and she's listening, and all she can hear is a baseball game. And she's in love with this, and I hope I'm getting the name right. I think it's Tom Gordon, but she's in love with this baseball player who's playing. There's only a monster in the entire thing for the last 5% of the book. But the whole message of the entire book is dealing with adversity. And then I almost think like this was Stephen King spoofing horror. The monster shows up in the last 5 minutes, she defeats the monster, and then she goes. And it was so inspiring. It was a horror story that actually inspired me. Because I was like, if she can make it that long in the woods, I can be okay. Like when I'm, I don't know, lonely, or when I'm, separated from people, or yeah. And there are some things that are really inspiring about the characters too that make it through those. That's interesting. So how did your interest evolve? Where did we go from Stephen King?
So, well, I read a lot of Stephen King. So basically, when I was in high school, I'd never read Stephen King until I was in high school. And I had a English teacher who I was over at her house for some extracurricular thing. She was like the sponsor of, some club that I was a part of. And she had a copy of The Shining. And I was like, oh, I've never read anything about Stephen King. She's like, well, you should borrow this book and read it. And I borrowed the book and read it in like a day, right?
And then
it's amazing.
And then your parents had her arrested.
Yeah, pretty much. Right. And, for me, it's all downhill from there. I mean, I've read a bunch of Stephen King books, but I've still not read one I thought was better than The Shining. Pet Sematary is right up there. Pet Sematary is so intense. I mean, it is an intense book. But
do you know the story about how he wrote Pet Sematary, or why he it's very interesting. So he wrote Pet Sematary, took the manuscript, put it in a drawer, was scared by it himself, and said, I don't know where that came from, and I'm never going to publish it. Years later, he had one book left on his book deal before he could move to his new publisher. So he just pulled it out and put it there. But it literally scared him.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I mean, it'll stick with you. And you talk about dealing with grief. Maybe that's one of the reasons, is because we've all been there, right? Like, we've all had grief. Hopefully most of us have never experienced the kind of grief in the book, but many people have. And I think there is a lot of horror. If you don't want to see yourself in it, you can remove yourself from it. Because, how often am I going to be on a spaceship fighting an alien, right? But in
hopefully
Pet Sematary, yeah, exactly. Hopefully soon. In Pet Sematary, the main crisis of the book is something every single person could imagine themselves being a part of. And in that book, the main character is doing things that you, in your brain, know are insane. He shouldn't do this. You're screaming at the book, don't do it. But in your heart, you're wondering what you would do in that situation. And you're thinking, how would I be able to not take advantage of that temptation? Temptation is one of those things Stephen King is so good at encapsulating. And I've heard him talk about sort of the monkey's paw and how it inspires him a lot. That old story about you get a wish, but every time you make a wish, you'll get what you asked for, but there's a cost.
Right.
And yet people keep making the wishes, even as the costs pile up. And I think this is a similar thing. There's this cost, but the temptation to end that grief, that terrible grief that you're feeling, is so overwhelming. How do you resist that? And it's a brilliant book, and he's a brilliant author. And I'm glad that he gets the respect he deserves, because sometimes people look at horror and they're like, oh, genre fiction. That's just for the masses. That's to read at the beach or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is. And there's nothing wrong with that, number one. But number two, there's a lot of depth here that you might not find in your most recent Booker Prize winner or whatever. But anyways, so read Stephen King, got into Stephen King, was really into horror movies. And then when I was in college, I think I was in college. I can never remember if I was in college or in my first year of law school. It's possible I was in my first year of law school. But I had always heard about this H.P. Lovecraft character. But I'd never read anything, and I just had this sort of vague notion of Lovecraft. And I was in like a Barnes and Noble, and I saw one of the books. It was The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Tales. Is the name of it. And I picked it up and was like, I'm going to buy this, and just devoured it. And so that was because for the first time, I really like Stephen King. I really like what he does, but there's something about the way H.P. Lovecraft looks at the world that was just terrifying to me. I think because King, all of his books have hope in them. They all have, I don't know if King's a religious person, but all of his books have a feeling of religion. Like, there is a God, there is good. Now, there's some very powerful evil out there too. but there typically is, Pet Cemetery, for instance, he is being tempted by evil, but there's good attempting to bring him back at the same time. And H.P. Lovecraft, very different. H.P. Lovecraft posits a world where actually, no, there's not even really good and evil. There is just this massive, uncaring universe that wants to devour you, not because it dislikes you, because you don't even matter to it.
That's
you don't
just
matter
what
to
it does.
Exactly. Any more than like an ant bed on the side of the river. When the river floods and destroys the ant bed, it's not that the river is angry. That's just what happens, right? And the river has no concern for the ant bed. And that's essentially, humanity and the universe. And then, and sort of parallel with that, this notion of something ancient that's so much older than us, that was here before we were here. Like, I've always loved that idea has always been something that fascinates me. It's become very mainstream and sort of, quasi archaeological, those kind of circles, that maybe there were prior civilizations on Earth and everything like that. But I was always fascinated by that. And H.P. Lovecraft was ahead of his time on that. And so he combined this sort of uncaring universe with this sort of mysterious, unknown past. And I just ate it up. I thought it was amazing.
Yeah. So that was, you said, was that high school or was that college? That was college?
It was college going into law school.
Yeah. And so in Lovecraft, like, is that where we get the idea of like that cosmic horror? I know we call it like Lovecraftian horror, but it's that idea that you have a horror that's even bigger than humanity, where a lot of horror sort of operates within the threads of humanity.
Right.
Because I think of, it's funny, and it almost makes sense. Like if The Shining was your favorite Stephen King book, like I've always viewed The Shining, and I know other people have different views of it, but as really about things like addiction, isolation, all of these different elements. But I thought one of the things in reading Lovecraft's, a big piece of it was like how solitary and lonely and independent being a human being on this planet that may not care that much about us was. I mean, I'm curious, like, what? Oh, and the other thing about Lovecraft that I really loved, that was like a step up, the narrators were almost inevitably unreliable. And that was the first time I realized, like, hey, I can't really trust the narrator here even. And that adds another element to it for me.
Right, because most of the narrators, by the time they're narrating, have had something happen to them that's basically driven them mad. There's always a little bit of a question about how much you can trust exactly what they're saying. But yeah, I mean, Lovecraft. Lovecraft's a weird guy. He was. I don't know how much you know about him personally, but basically,
nothing. He
was this sort of ahead of his time guy growing up in New England. In some ways, like he wasn't of this world. Like he just of the world he grew up in. In some ways, he was ahead of his time. In some ways, he was born 100 years too late. He was, he loved history and he loved the past, and modernity wasn't something he liked. And that was part of his writing style. He was very isolated. You talk about isolation. I think one of the reasons that comes through so much is because he was sort of an isolated person, an extreme introvert. I think a xenophobe is probably the best way to describe him. He's sometimes described as a racist. I think that does not give him enough credit for how much he disliked people. He disliked basically everybody, including himself. It was just, he just really didn't like people that much at all, and had these sort of wild views about humanity. And I think, like most sort of geniuses, a lot of geniuses are not well-adjusted normal people, right? I mean, you see that a lot of time.
No.
In fact, I mean, I hate to say no geniuses are well-adjusted normal people, because I'm sure there's some out there who are, but you tend to see that. Stephen King talks about this, like the things he struggled with and how it's, helped his horror, right?
Yeah, right. Well, if you look at his first series of books, I think he talks very openly about his demons and his addiction through his first set of books. And I've always felt like, he had this one great line. I can't remember what it was about horror and about writing. Oh, I can. It's that his writing is a lie, or hold on, no, the truth wrapped in a lie, and that it was his therapy during that time. But you were saying about Lovecraft, you think that he, in many ways, he was writing his own feelings.
Right. I think only someone who had a lot of sort of anger in his heart towards his fellow man could have developed a cosmic theory of horror like he had, where mankind was so insignificant and so unimportant, and really just in overwhelmed. Right. I mean, there was most of Lovecraft's stories, even if the protagonist makes it through to the end, it's only at great cost. Like I said, maybe it's his sanity, maybe it's his health, but he's going to lose a lot. Maybe it's his family. There's no triumphant victory at the end in most of Lovecraft's
It's like
stories.
everybody's Job.
Right, everybody's Job. And it's sort of the inevitability of death is very much in Lovecraft's, because can you ever really win in this world? I mean, okay, you beat the clown and send him back to wherever he came from. Yay, well, in 30 years, you're still going to die, right?
Right,
And I think
yes, right.
there's very much some of that in Lovecraft, that it's just, at most, and you see this in a lot of his stories, generally speaking, for people out there who don't know, I mean, the idea of Lovecraft is that there are these sort of cosmic entities, vastly more powerful, knowledgeable, older than we are, who have come to Earth for various reasons and are asleep or dormant. They were here millions of years ago. Something happened. It's very unclear what. They're now sort of sleeping, but they are seeking to awake, or there are people seeking to awake them, or there are other cosmic entities that want to do so. And most of the stories are really, you can't stop them and you can't defeat them. All you can do is delay them, And in much the way, that's basically what life is. Death is inevitable. You can work out every day. You can eat healthy. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable. That is Lovecraft in many ways. Cthulhu may still sleep, but he's only sleeping for now. He will awaken eventually, right?
Very nihilistic.
There's a lot of nihilism in Lovecraft.
Yeah, I wonder whether Lovecraft inspired Stephen King's The It with the clown that comes back, what was it, 20, 30 years later. Wait, do you know if Lovecraft was admired during his time?
So he had a circle of admirers who were completely dedicated to him. He published most of his stuff in the old Weird Tales magazine. That's where most of his stuff was published. And the people who published Weird Tales liked him quite a bit. Obviously, they would publish anything he wrote. And then he had a circle of admirers that he would write letters to. One of the, some of them became significant in their own ways, literary figures in their own ways. For instance, he was very close to Robert Howard, who developed the Conan the Barbarian storylines, which have spawned 1,000 different properties, right? And other people but the main one was a man named August Derleth, and he collected all of his works and started issuing the first books of Lovecraft. And Lovecraft's popularity really grew after his death, and probably now is when you really see the peak of it. Stephen King will tell you he was very much inspired by Lovecraft, and I think it's a good example. He has some very just Revival, if you've ever read that, Revival is pure Lovecraft. It is an absolutely Lovecraftian story that ends in a very Lovecraftian way. But he goes with that. It's one reason I like him, because he has that. Even Pet Sematary, like the end of Pet Sematary, the very last
scene
of Pet Sematary. Yeah. Very much. There's a lot of Lovecraftian stuff going on in that forest.
Because there's the piece in Pet Sematary where, as I recall, it's, they move into the town, all these sort of like weird things happen, that's all your warning and foreshadowing. They go out to the, walk on the path. And I still, like, in my head, I can still imagine their first walk out to the old Pet Cemetery. And eventually their son dies. I know I'm speeding through this. Their son dies, and he has this opportunity because he knows, I think it's the cat, gets buried in the pet cemetery, then comes alive. But of course, when he does it to his son, he's never the same. But toward the end of the book, his wife dies, and he still, I relate to this dude in this particular moment in terms of being such a knucklehead. He buries her, and I totally did not expect the last scene where she walks in and sticks her hand on his shoulder. That was not the ending I was expecting for him. I was expecting he will learn his lesson. So I almost felt like King was trying to drive the hammer into our heads on that point about that.
And it's interesting because King, his stories usually end on a high note.
Yep, and that one
Stephen King, that one does not. Stephen King stories, the main person almost always comes out on top. And that one, definitely not.
Yes, no.
And I think, that's, I mean, I'd be interested to know what Allison Dixon thinks about Pet Sematary, because, she's a huge Stephen King fan, but it's a great one.
It's a great one. I agree.